I recently spoke with Ifetayo Harvey for the Conscious Evolution podcast about her healing journey, her policy work, and harm reduction. Ifetayo is a truly inspiring young woman. Her personal experience of having her father arrested, put in jail, and later deported for drug charges informs all of the great work she does today and empowered her to create the People of Color Psychedelic Collective, which is a body of members dedicated to psychedelic healing and education based in the United States. The collective nurtures leaders to work in our communities to undo the harms caused by the war on drugs and oppressive systems of injustice. Please note there is a content warning in this episode for the mention of suicide. I do believe you will enjoy the conversation. It's time to upgrade your life. Welcome to the Conscious Evolution podcast. I'm Dr. Andrea Pennington, Chief Psychedelic Officer for Innate Vitality. In this podcast and our live events and retreats, we explore ways to hack enlightenment by integrating ancient wisdom and modern neuroscience with transpersonal psychology. From plant medicine and psychedelics to breathwork, mindfulness, and neurofeedback, my guests and I will shine a light on the unique capacity that we have to use our conscious mind to evolve individually and collectively as a species. Tune in each week on your favorite podcast player or the Pennington Media YouTube channel for interviews and discussions about holistic healing of trauma and adverse childhood experiences, burnout recovery, and intentional wellness. Ifetayo Harvey, thank you so much for joining me for the Conscious Evolution podcast. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's an honor. I have been following your work as I've come into the world of psychedelic-assisted therapy, and I'm so grateful for all that you're doing for people of color, the people of the global majority. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So I'd love to just jump in, if you don't mind. First, just to give my audience a little bit of background. I've already been fangirling and stalking you on the internet, but for those people who don't know your story yet, how is it that you even came into psychedelics and wanting to found the People of Color Psychedelic Collective?
Sure. Yeah. So when I was in college, I was looking for an internship to do during the summer of my junior year. And I came across the Drug Policy Alliance's website, and I was blown away by it because I never came across an organization that spoke about people who use drugs in a compassionate way. And that really struck me. So I decided to apply for the internship. And what motivated me really was my experience of growing up with my father in prison. When I was 4, my dad went away to prison. He was sentenced to 15 years for cocaine trafficking. And he served about half of his sentence, and he was deported back to Jamaica. And this experience impacted me a lot because as a child, I was really close and really fond of my dad. And, to have him taken away was traumatic. And so I started learning about the harms of the war on drugs and realizing that I wasn't the only kid who had a parent in prison for drug charges. I wasn't the only kid who had a parent who got deported for drug charges either. And I started to see the bigger picture around me of how these policies and these laws were destroying our communities. And it was at the International Drug Policy Reform Conference in 2013 that I first learned about the healing properties of psychedelics. I came there to be their opening plenary speaker, and it was an amazing experience. But at the same time, I was still dealing with a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety, a lot of suicidal ideation. This is during my senior year of college. And after I spoke at the opening plenary, I went to a few panels, and one of those was on end-of-life anxiety. And psychedelics, and I was really fascinated by it because for some reason I relate it to that existential anxiety and dread that a lot of people with terminal illnesses are facing. And even though I wasn't facing a terminal illness, I just related to it for some reason. It resonated with me. And I knew that, people use psychedelics recreationally. I'm a college student, so a lot of my friends were already experimenting. And I knew that my mom had experimented back in the 70s with, acid and stuff. So I was like, this seems really interesting. So after the conference, I went back to school and decided I want to try mushrooms. And so I asked my friends, I was like, how do I do this? What do I do? What is it like? What do I need to be prepared for? And they gave me the rundown and took care of me and sat with me. So it was a really transformative experience because it helped me see the value in my life and the people around me in a way that I needed to be reminded of in that moment.
Wow. That is so profound. I mean, there's just a whole range of emotions. Like, I can totally feel for you with, having your father deported and then finding out that there's a whole other side to drug use, but also drug policy. So where is your father now? And is he aware, I would imagine, of all the stuff that you're up to?
Yeah, so my dad, he still lives in Jamaica. He lives and works in Jamaica. And he is aware of the stuff that I do. And I think that to him, it's kind of hard to believe in a way, because when he was in the US, he couldn't really talk about drugs, or people weren't really talking about how you shouldn't go to prison for using drugs. And now the conversation is shifting to where we're even talking about folks who sell drugs too, and the reasons why they get into that work. So I think he's just like, he has a hard time kind of wrapping his head around a lot of the stuff. But I think for me, it's so important to remember what my dad went through as I'm in these spaces, especially in the psychedelic space, because I think there's this tendency to kind of divorce our psychedelic experiences from the larger war on drugs and the history and the trauma there. So I always try to, remind myself that the way that I speak about my own personal drug use or the policies around drugs is a privilege in a lot of ways. And yeah, I think that, having this relationship with my dad kind of motivates me to keep going.
It's so inspiring. And I can imagine how it is hard to wrap one's head around it, especially given his experience. And, I'm older than you. I did grow up in the 70s hearing all of the Just Say No and the DARE movement, all of this. So even for me to have come out just a few years ago about my psychedelic use, at first it felt like, how do I get my head around this? And now sharing with people of color that we actually need to reclaim our right to do whatever it is that we choose for ourselves, but in particular, reclaiming these medicines as sacred. And they're part of our indigenous history. For your father, I'm sure that these are things that he grew up seeing and knowing in Jamaica. And my mother's from British Guyana. So, there's a long history there. So what is your vision now for the people of color psychedelic collective?
Yeah, I totally agree that it's important for folks of color to feel comfortable enough to reclaim these things and not feel like this is like some white people stuff because it's not. And that's how, histories get erased and people get left out of certain narratives. But my vision for the collective is really about creating a a space of education and community building for people of color to get involved in this movement around healing, around justice, around unpacking our trauma. We started a few years ago just casually meeting on Zoom like this and talking about our experiences in the psychedelic space and how we haven't felt seen and heard for so long. And that evolved into us doing projects together. And then that evolved into us creating a nonprofit and, fundraising a bunch of money to do more programming. So we're really focused on strengthening our internal infrastructure so we can expand in a way that is sustainable. And also, continuing to educate people not only on the therapeutic uses of psychedelics, but also how the war on drugs have impacted our communities. How can we come together and heal, but also build a movement? Because there's one thing to, educate yourself about psychedelics and feel empowered to use them. It's another thing to actually organize with folks and create a space where we're taking a stand or we are aligning ourselves with certain values. So that's something I'm really interested in is taking my organization and also connecting with other organizations, other individuals, and seeing where there's common values and building power from that. Because I think that there are so many new organizations, companies, corporations popping up in the psychedelic space, and it's hard to keep up with. And it's also hard to know who's here because they actually value people or versus who's here to make money. And I think those are two very different trajectories a lot of times. But if we don't start to act and organize ourselves, then these corporations are going to take over psychedelics and totally whitewash them and basically price us out of our own healing in a way. That's, I tend to be on the more pessimistic, cynical side of things. So that's my concern and that's my fear. I could be proven wrong. I'd love to be proven wrong, but
well, I'm right there with you.
Yeah, I've also seen how this plays out with cannabis too, right? After working at the Drug Policy Alliance for 5 years, I've seen, the campaign start and finish and be implemented, and bureaucracy and other things tend to get in the way when it comes to implementing equity. So I think that's something that I want to keep uplifting, because we can't just, sit around and do our little activities. That's fun and important, but we also have to build power. So when these big entities do come up, we have a say-so in how we want these substances to be regulated and dealt with and respected.
Amen. I'm right there with you. As a physician coming into the space of offering ketamine right now, because that's legal. I'm doing the MAPS certification with IPI so that I can sit with people with MDMA and psilocybin when they become legal. And I have also been just really concerned about the whitewashing of psychedelics. And you already know this, but for those who are just tuning in, for the last 100 years, the research in any medical setting has been very skewed toward white folks, unless it was, the illegal experimentation on Black people, talking about the Tuskegee experiment. So I want to see more people of color talking about our experiences so that we can start to normalize the safe use as well as in research. But I'm also really concerned that we need more people investing. So I think we've seen a little bit of investment in cannabis from Black folks, but not nearly as much as should be for those who might be interested. And I feel like you're right. If we leave everything as it's running on its own, the whole psychedelic space would be operated predominantly by white people and predominantly by white cishet men. And that skews everything. Like, these are also our medicines. They've been in part of our indigenous roots for thousands of years. And so I'd really love to see people creating their own clinics and retreat centers and companies. So yeah, anyway, I'm off on a tangent here. Is that, do you think that the People of Color Psychedelic Collective would be involved in any of the investment side of things? Because that's the part that I see is missing.
Yeah, I agree that there is a gap there. I don't think that we be involved in some of the for-profit stuff, just because we are incorporated as a nonprofit, so that gets a little murky when we start to, even if we share someone's like store or something on our external channels, that also, there's so many rules around that. So, but, I do think that it is important that folks like myself and, other members in my collective are aware and educated on how these things work. How does investing work? How does starting a business work? What are the ins and outs of it? Because that way we can be advocates to other folks in our community who have questions. I remember when cannabis first started being legalized, fully legalized with Colorado and Washington. So many of my family members in Georgia, my family is from a small town in Georgia, and they're like, well, how do I get into cannabis? I have some land. I want to grow some weed. And it puts me on the spot, because I have to explain to them, like, A, why you can't do that, B, why it's illegal, and how you have to approach these kind of things, basically, especially in a state like Georgia. So I think the same thing needs to be happening with psychedelics. When we're, looking at these ballot initiatives, we need to be talking about, like, okay, well, what are the points of entry for small business owners? What are the reparations? Like, are we talking about that? When we talk about how these medicines have been taken from indigenous cultures, and we look at the state that a lot of indigenous people are living in North America, Central, South America, why aren't we talking about drug war reparations for psychedelics? So I think that it's a matter of, being in these conversations and bringing up these questions, and then disseminating that information back to people. That to me is important, because I see so many, government programs that are out there, but people aren't aware that they exist, or they don't know how to apply for a license. So there's a lot of education that needs to be done around these things. And I think that's where I see the collective coming in, is like educating people. Okay, this is how our communities can benefit. If you are a person who went to prison for weed, this is how your record can get expunged. This is how you can apply for a small business license. I think that's our role, is just, letting people know this is a system. This is how you get in. Here are the barriers. Here are the challenges. Here's how we can advocate for better. And here are the rooms you need to be in to kind of challenge a lot of what's coming down.
I'm Dr. Andrea Pennington, Managing Director for Make Your Mark Global, and I am calling for some new authors for one of our group anthologies called Sacred Medicine. We are calling for authors of all kinds all around the world who have stories to share about psychedelic-assisted therapy, psychedelic medicine, sitting in ceremony with Kambo, Bufo, 5-MeO-DMT, ayahuasca, psilocybin mushrooms, Mescaline, peyote, you name it, we want to hear about it. And in particular, we are publishing stories of good and challenging trips because I really want people to understand the breadth and the depth of experiences that can come when sitting with psychedelic medicine. I personally have been helped so much in my own healing journey, and I'm now sitting in ceremony with clients, and I know that people need more information on what is safe, what's not, what's to be expected, and what might catch you off guard. So if this sounds like a book that you want to be a part of, then please click the link in the description or in my bio so that you can share your story or your concept totally free. We at Make Your Mark Global do all of the heavy lifting, the editing, the formatting, getting the book globally distributed on Amazon and other book retailers. And you retain 100% copyright for your story. We are really looking forward to bringing this book out to the world in 2023. So share this video or the link with other people that you know who want to be featured in a book about sacred medicine. I look forward to reading your story. Switching gears a little bit, how have psychedelics personally helped you? Obviously, it shifted your whole career life focus, but how about you in terms of healing your own trauma? Has it been helpful? Is this something that you continue to benefit from?
Yeah, definitely. Like I said earlier, when I first learned about psychedelics, I was dealing with a lot of depression and anxiety and suicidal ideation. And I had also, I guess, formally had been diagnosed with major depression. And for some reason, it hit me really hard. Like, I knew that I had depression forever, but hearing it from a professional, it confirms it for you. And I was really struggling. And this is like my senior year. I went to Smith in Massachusetts. So after my first mushroom trip, it felt like a reset, ultimately. It felt like I was reminded why I should stay alive, why my life has value. I was reminded what it feels like to laugh. That's like, those strong belly laughs where you're almost crying. That's what mushrooms showed me in my first trip, that like you can go from laughing hysterically to crying in a matter of minutes. And that's okay. That's in a nutshell, that's life. Yes. And I think it also showed me that each day it can take a lot out of us. And that's why it's so important for us to rest and reset every day. I also saw just like the beauty of life more and in nature. I think when you are struggling with depression, it like puts these, the saying rose tinted glasses, but with depression, I feel like it's gray tinted glasses, where you're seeing everything in grayscale and you're not really, the things that excite you normally don't excite you anymore. The things that are beautiful don't really pique your interest. You're just like going from point A to point B. And psychedelics kind of show me like, there's life all around you. I never saw, I remember when my first trip, the mushrooms were kicking in, and I was like on this nature trail with my friend walking outside early in the morning. And I see like all the trees and all the leaves like breathing and the water like glistening. And I'm like, whoa, I was like fascinated by it. And I'm like, it just showed me, it reminded me of my childhood imagination in a way. And for a long time, I really identified more with atheism and agnosticism. And I think psychedelics gave me a sense of spirituality because I was seeing the unseen in a way. And that kind of gave me the confirmation that I needed since I was a kid, growing up in Charleston, where it has such a a dark history when it comes to our ancestors and our enslavement. And growing up, I felt like I would feel a lot of spiritual energy. I grew up going on field trips to plantations and other historical sites that were had a very dark history. And as a kid, you don't really have the language to explain what you're feeling or how to identify any of these things. So with psychedelics, I think I was able to kind of let my guard down around that kind of stuff and really feel those presences a bit more in a way that I would never have let my guard down before. So I think psychedelics helped me, definitely come into spirituality and also come into appreciating my ancestors a bit more. I've always been a person who is really interested in my family history. I've been researching my family since I was about 14, and I love learning about their stories and who they were. And when I first started doing mushrooms, sometimes I would get visions of people who I didn't know who they were. But they would be talking to me and telling me that, oh, it's going to be okay. Don't worry. Because I get a lot of nausea with mushrooms. So I would always get these messages at the beginning of my trip, it's going to be okay. Just relax. Just, let the mushrooms do their thing. And that message would come in different forms, whether it be a tree or a vision in my mind. So, I think psychedelics have brought me closer to my ancestors and spirituality. And it also just helps me process things and see things a little differently. I've been going to therapy since 2010, and I've been grateful to have worked with a lot of good therapists. But it's funny because after I do mushrooms or another psychedelic, going to therapy a few days after, it's word vomiting. My therapist was like, whoa, do we need to book another session this week? And because it brings up so much, but it also helps you process all these things that are on your mind. And it helps you see things a little bit differently. So being able to look at your pain and your trauma from a different point of view is important, because you're able to detach from it in a way that helps you realize that, oh, I didn't do anything wrong, or this thing happened to me and it's not my fault. It's terrible, it's hurtful, it's painful, but this is not a failure on my part as a person. This is something external that I had no control of. And I think that it helps you almost give yourself that compassion that you need so much. It's like giving yourself a hug in a way. And that's what I needed, when I first came into psychedelics. I needed to be reminded that, life is hard sometimes, but you have people who love you and people who care about you. And in the midst of this difficult time, there's beauty all around you.
That's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. I know those feelings, having had many periods of my life where I had suicidal ideations, and it's exactly as you say, that those gray colored glasses where it's nothing piques your interest. You feel what's the point? And I'm so glad that you were able to have some deep belly laughs and start seeing that there is life around you. Really beautiful. And I'm also hearing that when you get to go to your therapist and your word vomit, that allows you to integrate some of the insights and some of the things that are coming up from your subconscious for you to make sense of it all and then move forward.
Oh yeah, definitely. Working with mushrooms especially have brought up old memories. I'm like, oh, I didn't realize that thing affected me so much. That's real and that's valid, and that makes so much sense. You start to put the puzzle pieces together once these old memories start resurfacing, and then, working with your therapist or your integration coach or whoever, it starts to kind of make sense. Like, oh, this is why I cope with this in this way. This is where this all started, and I think it's so important for us to try to make sense of ourselves, because it's going to help us feel more compassion for ourselves. And it's also going to help us know how to take care of ourselves better, and inform the folks around us how to, look out for us as well. But yeah, I think it's so important that we as, Black folks are able to have these conversations around struggling with suicide, because it's something that's heavily stigmatized in our communities. But it's also something that a lot of us experience in silence and shame.
Absolutely. And that's absolutely one of the reasons why I decided to move my practice into psychedelic assisted therapy as a physician, because I lost 2 friends to suicide in the last few years.
Wow,
and one of them was a Black physician, a very dear friend of mine. And I don't think I'd ever shared with him my depression history. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that he even knew that ketamine was available to at least stop suicidality right in the moment. So if someone's suicidal, you're probably not going to get into a ayahuasca retreat or some others, but at least there's ketamine for people that's legal. So for me, sharing these stories has been really important, because I don't want anyone else to suffer in silence for the decades that I did. And like you said, for me, my mother transitioned last year, and I sat in ceremony with psilocybin mushrooms. And just like you described, I saw like this scene from my childhood, and I came to understand, like there was no words because it was probably before I could speak, but I came to understand why I have had this feeling that I'm not good enough and that everything is my fault. Like I've never had those words. The only words I've kind of like negative self-talk that I've felt is I'm not enough. I'm not good enough, not smart enough, like not enough. But in that mushroom ceremony, I saw where this imprint of it's all my fault came from. And coming out of that and just having like immense compassion, like you're talking about, I was able to like give little baby Dre a hug. Like, good Lord, all of that toxicity that I was like bathed in from birth all the way up to, So yeah, I think what you're describing is why I want more people to be aware of what's possible for us.
Yeah. And it's, I think it's so important for us to talk about these things, because you mentioned earlier the medical community, has a history of treating Black people, Indigenous folks poorly, right? And as psychedelics become ushered into the clinical medical settings, there's going to be a lot of us who are like, I don't want to go around these crazy white people.
Exactly. We don't know what they're going to do to us,
Yeah, we don't. And there's been a history of the medical community, upholding the war on drugs too. So we have to continue talking about how these substances can benefit us, and they don't solely belong to the medical community, right? There's a lot of community-led organizations, a lot of Indigenous healing practitioners out there. So it's really about dispelling fear, because I think a lot of us are afraid of like losing control.
Yeah.
And that's what mushrooms tend to do, especially as you get higher up in dosage. Is like you feel like kind of a loss of control of your body and a little bit of your mind for especially the come up, like the first like half hour to an hour, you're like, oh man, like am I gonna die? And I think it's also important for us to talk about harm reduction. And okay, if you want to use psychedelics, these are the ways you can keep yourself safe. Here's why it's important to have someone, who is sober and a trusted friend with you to support you. Here are some things you can do after as you come down. I think it's so important to talk about those things because our communities tend to be, we get left behind, or I don't even want to say left behind, we get purposely excluded from a lot of these conversations. And then we also have to reckon with the fact that, we face more law enforcement interactions than white people do, right? We're unfairly targeted. So we have to talk about that. And, it would be a nightmare for me to come in contact with law enforcement while I'm under the influence of mushrooms or some other psychedelic. And in my experience, I've been on, acid once. My first time doing acid was at a Grateful Dead concert in Chicago with my MAPS colleagues when I worked at MAPS. And I remember we were walking on Michigan Avenue. All the Deadheads are like all over Millennium Park. And we see this Black guy being arrested by the Chicago police. And one of my colleagues, I remember, says like, "Oh, what are the chances the only Black guy at the concert is getting arrested and all these white people are running around, high off their ass?" Mm-hmm. And they're just like, the cops are holding this Black man in handcuffs, just like standing in front of their SUV, not doing, it was really weird. And I'm on acid, so I'm just like, oh man. But we have to talk about those things. How, when we go into a space, if you want to go to a Grateful Dead concert, great, but you can't forget that you're Black too in America, unfortunately. So we also have to talk about that aspect, and then also address the fact that, while we may have a focus on psychedelics, we also have to talk about other drugs as well, because a lot of people aren't just using psychedelics as, recreationally. A lot of times folks are mixing with other substances. And I like to tell folks to avoid that because when you mix substances, it increases your chances of getting sick or something else happening. So that said, people are still going to do what they want to do. So, people are going to mix mushrooms and weed, or weed and alcohol, or acid and alcohol. And we have to talk about some harm reduction strategies around those polysubstance users.
Yeah. And I think the harm reduction conversation can't be done enough, because I think before Black and brown folks are going to be enrolling in studies, they're probably going to be doing stuff underground. Mm-hmm. And so having test kits to see if what you're taking is actually the real deal. And like you said, informing at least some sober person, someone who can look after you or be on call. And of course, there's the Fireside Project, which I'm grateful that now people have a toll-free number to call and to get peer support without the risk of them tipping off law enforcement.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, these conversations are going to become more and more relevant, because what we're seeing right now in the US, there's so much heavy stuff going on, right? There's, we've been hit with a number of mass shootings this year. And then some of the things happening on a policy level, like with abortion, and COVID still happening. Yeah. So there's just so much weighing on the, individual. And I think more and more people are going to be turning to alternative ways of healing themselves, or just trying to get through the day. And psychedelics are going to be part of that conversation. So I think that, we as advocates need to get ready to kind of ramp things up in the next year or two, because we're going to be seeing, more and more people using psychedelics, or at least interested in psychedelics. And we're also going to see more states and more cities decriminalize and legalize psychedelics.
Yeah. Well, we're ramping up. This conversation is part of the ramp up and destigmatizing for sure. Is there anything else you'd like to cover before we wrap up?
Let's see. Well, Let's see. I don't have anything in particular. I think that, yeah, psychedelics can be a great tool for healing. It can be a great tool for imagining. I think they are one tool in the toolbox. And psychedelics aren't for everyone, but there are other ways to kind of channel psychedelic experiences like breath work, holotropic breath work. And there's also just a bunch of other healing modalities out there. I think it's really about making them accessible and affordable to everyday people, and creating an ecosystem of like healing and care. Ultimately, I think it's, for me, it's not even about psychedelics all the time. It's about creating a world where people feel free and, free to do what they want with their bodies as well.
Well, we will invite you to come and join us in Georgia, which is one of the states where Georgia and California are where we are licensed, and we'll be doing some retreats and ceremonies. And as you said, some of our retreats will just include breath work for people who aren't yet ready to experience medicines. So we'd love to have you.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, I would love to come down to Georgia. That's where my family is.
Yeah, awesome. Ifetayo, thank you so much for sharing your time and your story with us. I know that this is going to be a blessing to so many people. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed talking to you today.
Awesome. So there you have it, my friends. Check out the People of Color Psychedelic Collective at pocpc.org. Thank you for tuning in to the Conscious Evolution Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend, subscribe, and leave us a review and rating on your favorite podcast player. This helps us get the content out to a larger audience. And to watch the video version of the podcast, visit the Pennington Media YouTube channel. Want more info on how psychedelics may improve your mental well-being, how to choose a retreat, or what to look for in a shaman? Get on the Psychedelic Curious email journal. The link is in the show notes and on my website, andreapennington.com. You can also sign up for my free masterclass series, where each month I take a deep dive into a topic in holistic healing, trauma recovery, self-love, resilience, and psychedelic-assisted therapy.